I raised everyone else in this family, until one day I discovered I was the one who had been fooled all along. They say you don't notice the cracks until the house starts falling down. But I suppose my story begins long before that. In the little kitchen of my first home, where the air always smelled of cinnamon and wood smoke, I was 23 when we moved into that house. Back then, I thought my life would be small in the best way. Church on Sundays, neighbours who waved from across the fence, children who'd always come home for supper. The floors creaked in winter, the windows rattled in the wind, and I loved every inch of it. I raised 3 children in that house, and in some ways, I raised half the neighbourhood too. The front door was never locked. If someone knocked, it was usually a neighbour dropping off rhubarb or asking if I had sugar to spare. I can still picture the long summer afternoons, the screen door banging as little feet ran in and out, the old radio humming in the background, the smell of pies cooling on the counter. I was the one who made sure every birthday was remembered, every scraped knee cleaned, every hungry belly fed. The world felt safe then, or maybe I just believed it was. We had traditions. Oh, so many traditions. Friday nights meant stew and fresh bread. Christmas Eve meant we stayed up late and told stories by the fire, and on the first warm day of spring, I'd gather the children for a picnic in the orchard behind the house. People used to tell me I was the glue of the family. I wore that title proudly. I thought it meant I was loved, but glue holds things together, even when the pieces don't belong anymore. There were hints, of course. A strange look passed between my eldest and his wife when I'd mentioned the land my father left me, the way conversations would stop when I entered the room. But I brushed it off, because when you love people, you want to believe they love you back in the same way. I didn't pay attention then. I wish I had. I remember one afternoon in particular. The church ladies had come over for tea, Mrs. Palmer, who always wore too much perfume, and quiet little Ruthie with her soft voice. They sat at my table, sipping from mismatched cups, when Ruthie leaned in and said, almost as softly to hear, "Margaret, you're too good to them. Don't let them take advantage." I laughed. Take advantage, my own family. I changed the subject. It's funny, the things you remember years later. How a sentence you ignored at the time can echo in your mind like a bell you can't unring. Looking back, that was the last truly peaceful season of my life. I didn't know then that everything I'd built, everything I'd given, was slowly being chipped away. Not by strangers, but by the very people I'd taught to stand on their own 2 feet. And the first real crack, it came the day I went looking for my mother's brooch. It was a Tuesday morning in early spring when I noticed it was gone. I'd been planning to wear my mother's brooch to church the following Sunday, a little silver oval with a tiny pearl in the centre, worn smooth from years of careful fingers. It wasn't valuable to anyone else, but to me, it was the last piece of her I had. I kept it in the top drawer of my dresser, tucked in a small box under my scarves. But when I opened the drawer that morning, the box was there, the scarves were there, but the brooch had gone. At first, I thought maybe I'd misplaced it. I pulled every scarf out, checked the pockets of my dresses, even got down on my knees and looked under the bed. Nothing. I didn't want to believe it had been taken. That's not the kind of thing you imagine happening in your own home. That afternoon, my eldest son, David, came by with his wife, Leela. We were having coffee when I mentioned the missing brooch, more out of sadness than suspicion. Leela froze, just for a second, then smiled and said, "Oh, I'm sure it'll turn up. Things always do." David didn't say anything. He just stirred his coffee and changed the subject. It was such a small moment. But something about the way they both avoided my eyes stayed with me. And then there were the coins. I kept a large jar of spare change in the pantry. It wasn't for anything important, just for ice cream treats when the grandchildren came over. One day, the jar was half empty. The next, it was almost gone. I asked around. No one had touched it, of course, but when I walked into the living room that night, David and Leela were talking in low voices. The moment they saw me, they stopped. The weeks went by, and the odd little things kept happening. I'd find drawers slightly open when I knew I'd closed them. Papers moved from where I'd left them. Once, I could have sworn I smelled my mother's perfume in the guest room. The kind you can't buy any more, though no one had been staying there. And then came the whispers. At the market, I overheard two neighbours talking. After the wedding, they said she wasn't right in the head. Maybe that's why they're, managing things for her. I didn't ask them to explain. I just walked home with my groceries and tried to pretend it didn't matter. But the moment that changed everything. The one I can still see as clear as yesterday came late one Sunday evening. I'd been tidying the living room after the grandchildren went home. I picked up my Bible from the coffee table, meaning to put it back in its usual spot by my bed. It felt heavier than it should have. When I opened it, something slipped out and landed on the carpet. It was an envelope, yellowed at the edges, addressed to me in my late husband's handwriting. I stared at it for a long moment before I picked it up. I wasn't ready for what was inside. The envelope trembled in my hands, though I wasn't sure if it was the paper shaking or me. I sat down right there on the rug, my knees refusing to hold me, and slid my finger under the flap. Asterisk inside was a folded letter, my name written across the top in my husband's firm, steady hand. I could almost hear his voice as I began to read. Margaret, if you are reading this, it means I'm no longer here to tell you in person. I want you to know that the land your father gave you, the orchard and the adjoining fields, is yours alone. It is not to be sold, leased, or given away without your full knowledge and consent. It is your security, your inheritance, your right. I've arranged with our lawyer to keep the deed in your name, and the tenants know to pay you directly. If anyone tells you otherwise, they are lying. Trust yourself. I read it twice. Then a third time. By the end, my hands weren't trembling anymore. They were clenched into fists, because I knew exactly what this meant. David and Leela had been telling me for years that the farmland was too much for me to manage and that they had taken over handling things for my sake. They'd said the rent barely covered upkeep, so I never saw a cent. But my husband's words told a different story. I didn't want to believe it, not about my own son. But the memories began lining up like little soldiers in my mind. The strange looks, the conversations that stopped when I entered the room, the neighbors' whispers, the jar of coins, the missing brooch. And then another memory came to me, something I'd overheard from the back porch just months before. Lila's voice, low but sharp. She won't even notice. She's old. She forgets things. David's reply, muffled but certain. We've been doing it this long. Just keep quiet. I told myself at the time that I must have misheard. Now I knew better. The next day, I took the letter to the kitchen table and stared at it for hours. The clock ticking loud enough to hurt my ears. I wanted to cry. I wanted to scream. But instead, I made tea, and while the kettle boiled, I thought about what my husband had written. Trust yourself. Asterisk, that was the day the heartbreak began to harden into something else, something sharper, something that could cut. I didn't sleep that night. The letter lay on my nightstand, the folded paper glowing faintly in the moonlight. I kept turning over my husband's words in my mind, not just the warning, but the trust. He'd known this might happen, and he'd believed I would have the strength to face it. Morning came, but the light felt thin, like it had passed through too many shadows before reaching me. I made my tea, I buttered my toast, and for the first time in my life, I felt like a stranger in my own kitchen. Every mug, every spoon, every drawer I opened, all of it had been touched by hands that smiled at me while lying through their teeth. The betrayal wasn't just about the land. It was about every kindness I had given without keeping score. Every birthday card with $20 tucked inside. Every night I'd babysat so they could go out. Every Sunday dinner where I'd sent them home with leftovers for the week. And all the while, they'd been taking from me, piece by piece, quietly enough that I wouldn't notice, in church that week. The sermon was about forgiveness, I remember, sitting there in the pew, staring at the stained glass while the pastor spoke. The colours danced on my lap, red and gold and blue. Forgiveness, he said, sets you free. But what if forgiveness sets the other person free to keep doing what they've done? What if the chain is the only thing stopping them from striking again? I smiled at the neighbours as we left. But I didn't linger for coffee afterward. My mind was already somewhere else. That night, I pulled out the old address book from the drawer beside my bed, the one I hadn't touched in years. Inside were names I hadn't spoken to in decades. Tenants, friends of my husband, the lawyer, who had handled our will. One by one, I started making calls, just polite little chats at first. How are you? How's the family? Do you still have that place near the orchard? Most people were happy to hear from me. And with every conversation, I was gathering something. Far more precious than gossip, I was gathering proof. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing. Not Ruthie from church, not the neighbours, not even my youngest daughter who still visited once a week. When people think you're too old to cause trouble, they stop watching what you're doing. That suited me just fine. It took weeks, but by the end, I had everything, copies of rent receipts with my son's name on them, statements from tenants who'd been told I was too unwell to handle the property, and something else, something I didn't expect. One of the older tenants, Mr. Harris, told me about the night he'd seen Leela stumbling out of my orchard shed, drunk, stuffing something into her purse. Didn't seem right, he said, shaking his head. Didn't seem hers to take. My hands shook when I closed the phone, not from fear this time, but from the quiet fire beginning to build in my chest. They thought I was soft. They thought I was harmless, and for most of my life, I had been, but that part of me was over. I've learned something about getting older. People think age slows you down, but it also makes you patient, and patience, well, patience is a weapon, if you know how to use it. I didn't storm into David's house waving the letter like a flag. That would have given him the chance to spin a story, to make me look like the confused old woman they'd been painting me as. No. I needed something cleaner, something final, something they couldn't talk their way out of. Step one was the lawyer, not the one my son had been dealing with. No, I found the one who'd helped my husband all those years ago. His office smelled like old books and coffee gone stale. And he greeted me like no time had passed at all. When I laid the letter in front of him, he read it slowly, then nodded. Your husband was smart, he said. He protected you from exactly this sort of thing. I asked him how to take back what was mine. He leaned back, smiled faintly, and said, You don't need to take it back. You already own it. They're just squatting on the money. Step two was the tenants. One by one, I visited them, brought them pies, asked about their children, listened to their troubles. Then, very calmly, I handed them each a formal notice on the lawyer's letterhead, stating that all rent was to be paid to me directly, starting immediately. Some of them looked nervous. One or two apologized for going along with the arrangement before. I told them there was nothing to apologize for. Sometimes good people get caught up in someone else's lies. Step 3 was the proof. I copied every receipt, every notice, every statement I'd gathered and placed them in a neat folder. Not because I planned to go to court, but because I wanted to be ready if anyone dared challenge me. And then came the hardest part, waiting. I didn't tell a soul what I'd done. I cooked Sunday dinners like nothing was wrong. I asked David, about his work, smiled at Lila's stories, passed mashed potatoes across the table. But I noticed things, how David seemed a little distracted lately. How Lila kept glancing at her phone during meals. They were feeling it already. They just didn't know why. I decided the reveal would be at Thanksgiving. The whole family would be there. No one could accuse me of hiding in the shadows. I pictured it in my mind for weeks. The table full of food, the chatter, the laughter, and then the quiet. The moment the truth would drop into the room like a stone into still water. And when the ripples reached them, I'd still be sitting there, steady as ever. Thanksgiving morning arrived cold and bright. The kind of crisp November air that stings your cheeks and makes the windows steam over from the heat inside. I was up before dawn, basting the turkey, mashing the potatoes, arranging pies on the counter. From the outside, it looked like every other holiday I'd ever hosted. That was the point. By noon, the house was full, coats piled on the hall chair, laughter echoing down the hallway, the smell of roasting turkey spilling into every room. David came in carrying a bottle of wine, Lila trailing behind with a store-bought pie and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The grandchildren darted past me toward the living room. Leaving muddy footprints on the rug, I welcomed them. All hugged them, laughed at their small talk, because today I wasn't the old woman they thought they could fool. Today I was the woman they'd underestimated for the last time. Dinner was everything a holiday should be, warm, loud, almost too much. We passed dishes back and forth, clinked glasses, told stories. I waited until the last pie slice was gone. The coffee poured, the children beginning to fidget, then I stood. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I have something for you, David. I placed a plain white envelope beside his plate. He looked confused at first, then wary. Lila's hand tightened around her coffee cup. Inside the envelope was a single sheet of paper. The land deed with my name printed clear and bold, and a copy of the lawyer's letter to the tenants. I watched him read it. His face changed in slow stages, confusion, disbelief, then a flush of red creeping up his neck. Before he could speak, I said, "I know what you've been doing. It ends." Now, the room went silent except for the ticking of the clock. Even the children were still. Lila opened her mouth, but I raised a hand. No more lies. No more stories. The rent comes to me now. You can be angry if you want, but you can't change the truth. David set the paper down like it was burning. His fingers. He didn't look at me. Lila stared at the table. I took a sip of my coffee and sat back down. "Anyone want more pie?" I asked. The tension hung in the air like smoke, but no one moved. Eventually, the chatter picked back up, quieter, thinner, but I just kept eating my pumpkin pie, steady as stone. They left early that night. No one said it was because of the envelope. But I could feel it in the way David didn't quite meet my eyes when he hugged me goodbye, and in the way Lila avoided touching my hand. The grandchildren kissed my cheek and ran out into the cold, their laughter echoing down the walk, unaware of the war that had just ended in their grandmother's dining room. The next morning, the house was still, no clinking dishes, no overlapping voices, just the hum of the refrigerator and the faint scent of roasted turkey lingering in the air. I sat at the kitchen table with my tea and looked out over the orchard. It was mine again. The land, the choice, the right to decide what happened. To what my parents left me. The phone didn't ring that week or the week after. When it finally did, it was my youngest daughter checking in, her voice careful, as if I might shatter if she spoke too loudly. David didn't call. Lila didn't come by. Holidays grew smaller. Visits shorter. Some neighbors asked if I was lonely. But the truth was, I felt lighter than I had in years. I walked the orchard more often now, running my hand over the rough bark of the old apple trees. The tenants greeted me with nods and smiles, rent envelopes passed directly into my hands, and every time I thought of my husband's words in that letter, "Trust yourself," I had. And it had brought me here. There's a strange kind of peace in knowing you will never again be fooled in the same way. It doesn't erase the hurt, but it sharpens your sense of who you are, and who I am is not a woman to be quietly erased. They told me age would make me smaller, but this was when I found my real voice.